offer. It is one that's being researched and contributed to, but for that to be done, it needs to be properly resourced for it to be safe and effective, rather than demonising or marginalising further those who are engaged in those practices. So I think that's all I would add. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And finishing off with Andrea as well. Thank you.
Thank you. We're really grateful to Welsh Government for giving us funding for the Wales Sanctuary Service. And through that partnership, we give funding to BAWSO to deliver training, but that funding is not enough. And so that programme has had the same budget for the last 8 years, which means that year upon year, essentially the funding has gone down, not up, and hasn't stayed the same in terms of need. And there's a couple of things that's already been mentioned, but we also know that there is a gap in legal provision. So when people do need help around their immigration status, that also isn't there in Wales. We know that there's a desert, and so that's an added layer to the reason that people may not leave perpetrators of abuse. In addition to that, there isn't enough funding at the behavioural change level. And certainly there isn't enough funding at that early intervention level as well. We know that female asylum seekers are less likely to register with a GP, and where their partner is the main applicant, they're also less likely to register with the GP. And so that just means that those early signs of abuse are not likely to get picked up until something much more serious happens. And those are real causes for concern for us. In addition, we think there should be more money available because the widening of dispersal areas will mean that it'll be harder for local authorities and harder for practitioners to understand immigration status right across Wales as well. And that is a concern for us. So I completely agree with my colleagues, there isn't enough funding. The budget has stayed the same for 8 years, just in the funding stream that we get, and it isn't meeting demands, and it's not going to be meeting our future demands with the widening of dispersal areas and with the huge amount of safeguarding and trafficking issues that we're likely to see around the Ukraine crisis as well.
Thank you. Chair, do I have an opportunity to ask about no recourse to public funds as well?
Go ahead.
Thank you. Just really briefly, I'm sure are aware of the Scottish Government's programme for funding around no recourse to public funds. And we're actually taking evidence later from the colleagues in Scotland. Could you just give us your views on that, and what your views, very quickly, because we haven't got much time here, what your thoughts are around that being here in Wales, and because we've heard a lot about this gap around funding for NRPF people who find themselves in that situation. Thanks, Wanjiku, if you want to start. Very
yes.
quickly, if you don't mind, thank you.
No recourse to public funds is really an issue in Wales. As you're going to hear with the Scottish Government, nobody stands away just because they have no recourse to public funds, and that's the way we'd like it to be in Wales. We would like the Welsh Government to provide a ring-fenced funding for victims of domestic abuse or Valdez V who have no recourse to public funds. And this would ensure that if any woman turned up anywhere, to a statutory agency, to a voluntary agencies, anywhere, they went to NHS and said, I'm a victim of domestic abuse, support would be provided to her immediately without thinking about her immigration status. Because as it is now, your support depends on what your immigration status is. And the reason is there's no funding for that. So we would like what we're calling a last resort fund from the Welsh Government, where they're saying this money is for victims of domestic abuse who have no recourse to public funds. We're also saying that the Welsh Government needs to help us work with social services to provide the support that social services should provide to victims of domestic abuse. At the moment, it's a postcode lottery where one social service or one local authority to pick up a duty on a family that is going through domestic abuse. They'll pick up the woman, they'll place her in a refuge, and they'll make sure that she's supported until the end. Another local authority to say, oh, we'll only support the child and we have nothing to do with the mother. and they'll only support the support for children. And another local authority won't do anything. They'll say we have no funds to do that. So again, if that could be made in such a way that everybody that needs that support gets it, that would be really helpful.
Thank you. And Sarah and Andrea, I'd love to hear from you, but only if it's additional points, given that our time limits. Is there anything you'd like to add that hasn't been said?
One of the main differences in Scotland is that the Scottish Refugee Council is a strategic partner of the Scottish Government, and that means they're just able to move a lot faster on migrant issues. So it's something for Welsh Government to consider.
I think the only thing I would add very briefly is that by having a last resort fund for no recourse survivors, this would not be giving public funds directly to survivors, which would be problematic for their immigration status, but it would support specialist services, but it would also enable local authorities who are currently stepping back and saying we cannot provide this because we don't have the funds. It would ensure that proportionate support was offered to someone. It would remove that postcode lottery. It would allow the proper provision, and it would also reduce the ability to further exploit a vulnerability for migrant survivors in some areas.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks very much indeed. Moving on now to Sarah Murphy. Would you like to come in, please?
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here today. I wanted to ask some questions to you about the immigration status and data sharing. So, as you know, we've been out and we've been talking and doing and getting views on this. And anecdotally, you know, we have heard stories about how women are advised sometimes to go to frontline services like the police. You've already mentioned, you know, it would be best if they did sign up to the GP. Sometimes they come into contact with social services, especially if they have children. But we have heard of stories then where it appears that that information, that data on them has been shared with the Visa and Immigration and the Home Office. And even stories of women then being deported. So I just wanted to ask if any of you had any idea, had seen any of this, had heard of any of this, and what you think this, you know, the impact of this data sharing is having on women, and also, I suppose, your relationship with them. So is there anybody who would like to go first?
Yeah, I don't mind going fast, because very recently I've had an experience where we've been running a survey with Syriza Wales with Birmingham University, and what they wanted to do was to talk to a few asylum seekers, also victims of domestic abuse. And one of the things that we encountered is that nobody wanted to talk to anyone. They said, I'm not sharing my information with anyone. It's going to go to the Home Office, and I'm not ready to do that. So there's already that barrier where victims feel, oh, whatever information I give is going to end up in the Home Office, I'll be deported. We have to remember that our immigration services, and especially the interviewers, the first interview that asylum seekers attend, it's very hostile. They're very hostile, and they keep reminding you that you're lying, you're not telling the truth. In fact, they don't look at you as the victim. We've supported so many women through these sessions where we take them to the Home Office in Cardiff and in Croydon, and women come out broken. They're broken. So if you're going to say to that same woman that she's going to talk to the Home Office about anything about their abuse, they're not going to talk to them, because of that initial experience they have with them, that these people don't trust them, that these people have no time for them, and they make you feel so small. That's what women have said to us. So that immigration status, how does it then translate to people talking about their issues? It means that even if a woman is going through domestic abuse, she does not want to talk to the police, because as far as she's concerned, the police officers are the same as the people from the Home Office. They're these people that don't trust you, that don't listen to what you're saying. So there's that barrier, and we have to be very careful when we're talking to women, when we're holding focus groups, when we're asking them to complete questionnaires, because there's that fear. And in the end, what you say to the women with this Irida Wells survey, we say to them, don't give them your name, don't tell them anything, just tell them your story so that they don't know who you are. And that's the only way they could trust the process. So there's that, and we have to protect women. We have to make sure that we protect them. One of the things that have happened within DDVC is that if the perpetrator gets to the Home Office before the victim, if the perpetrator gets to the Home Office before the woman has contacted the Home Office to say that they're going through domestic abuse, they're able to change the story and say that the woman is no longer with them and that she should be deported out of the country. So all this creates fear with women. And I think that we should be able to help these women maintain their confidence, whatever it is they have with us. And there's need to create something between the statutory agencies especially and the Home Office, so that women can be reassured that your information is not going to be shared with the Home Office. There needs to be that firewall that is created between statutory, especially statutory agencies, because I think voluntary agencies get it and they try as much as possible to protect them. But that's one of the issues that happens. Your immigration status is so crucial, such that the women who just see a police car passing by and are so frightened and hide away, you know. So we have to take that into account every time we're dealing with victims.
Thank you so much. Andrea, if I can bring you in. And also, it's just, again, even if, are you aware, I suppose, it would be helpful for us if you are aware of any of that data sharing, if you have seen an example of that and an outcome of that. Is there anything that you would be able to tell us about?
I'll get back to you if I can on that one.
Of course.
On the point that Wanjiko made, the fear thing is only set to get worse. So the day that the Home Office announced the Rwanda scheme, we saw our phone lines and calls go through the roof, and it just sets that fear at a higher level. Everything that's coming out of the Nationality and Borders Bill is increasing that fear even more. We've also got the fact that immigration status will become more unsettled in the future, as everyone has to apply for their status every 2.5 years. So all of those things create this really hostile environment where fear is the overriding, well, one of the overriding factors why people wouldn't necessarily go and get support or trust authorities, particularly when they fled regimes in the past.
Thank you, Andrea. Sarah, would you like to come in?
Everything my colleagues have just said, and I think what I would add to this is that we are repeatedly calling for disaggregated data from state agencies. We're saying who is missing, what is being missed, and that environment of concern and fear for survivors means that we're running at cross purposes. We're trying to achieve disaggregated data at the same time as people are gravely concerned about sharing their information or even approaching state agencies. We have to work more closely with by and for organisations, with specialist support services, with spaces and places that survivors trust, in order to be able to collect and collate that data, because at the moment, there are parts of the picture we do not have clear enough evidence of. We only have it anecdotally. And that is compounded by the fear of those survivors, so that those people who are hiding can't be counted, but you sort of understand why they're hiding. So I think we have to think about building more effective collaborations. I think what Andrea said about sort of having a strategic partner who is able to straddle those two worlds is helpful for survivors. And actually what we're here and talking about is people experiencing abuse and oppression and how we make those routes easier for them.
Absolutely, thank you so much. And then Wendigo, you mentioned the firewall, and this is something that has been suggested as a potential solution in the written evidence. And we've also heard this when we've done the engagement sessions. And, you know, with the Senedd, we wouldn't necessarily have the powers here to be able to do that, to have a firewall between necessarily them. But what is a potential is that the agencies that are in Wales, like the social services, like the police and things like this, there could be a kind of a request, I suppose, to them to not necessarily, though, provide it, more education around that. What do you think of that?
I think that would be a very good idea, because currently what happens if a woman has no recourse to public funds, or she's under the high migration status is unconfirmed, if she seeks support from social services, the first thing they do is to contact the Home Office. That's how we know that data is being shared with the Home Office. The first thing they do is to share that information. So if and then she's very unhappy with us. So why did you refer me to social services? Now the Home Office knows them. I'm here now. So that something needs to be done if we're going to get the trust of the victims. Otherwise, she will say that to her friend, and she'll say, if you ever have a problem, don't go to BOWS or don't go to social services. Your information will be shared with the Home Office. So we really need to work on that. And I know with the pilot project with the Home Office were expecting us to give all the information about the victims that we're supporting, but we managed to bargain a deal where we said we're not sharing any dates of birth, any names, we're not sharing anything with you other than a category of the victim that we supported. We're not sharing any information, and we were lucky that they agreed to that, but we still have the problem with especially social services and local authorities that are dealing with victims who are under immigration laws.
That's very interesting, thank you. And then just my final question, any of you would like to answer it, it's just something I've been thinking about. We talk a lot about migrant women, people come into this country and, you know, needing to understand the laws that we have here and the rights that they have here in this country. And I would argue that, you know, under the human rights, they do have a right to privacy, they do have a right to protection, to safety. Yes. But the reason that their data is able to be shared is because at some point they give their consent that their data can be shared. But I heard at the engagement session that we did recently that people question, do they really understand what they're giving consent for? And if they don't understand what they're giving consent for, is it really consent? So really, should that data even be being collected on them if they can't actually give they can't, you know, give, they can't say that they want that to happen. They don't really understand the consequences of that. They're not being told what the potential consequences are. So I'd be interested to get your thoughts on that, please.
A lot of the women, and especially asylum seekers, do not have, they do not understand at the point where they're going for that interview that is so hostile, where somebody's kind of saying to them, you have to listen to me and I'm not listening to you. They'll sign up to anything. They're not aware that their data will be shared. And even if they're told it to be shared, they don't understand the extent to which their data is being shared. So I think there is need to educate and inform people. I don't know at what point, because there's a time where we talked about having these working with countries for people where people are coming from countries of origin, and just maybe it's a role for the embassies in those home countries where people are when people are seeking to come to the UK, for example, on a spousal visa, just educating these people on what their rights are before they arrive here. There's also a lot, on another note, a lot of the people that go out to get wives from abroad, they're already known perpetrators, and there's no information on them, and they come here and domestic abuse takes place, and we go back and find out he's a perpetrator. He's very well known. There's need for that for information to be shared with people, maybe immediately as soon as they've arrived in the country or into the UK. There should be those citizenship classes where people are being advised, and that's again on prevention agenda, where we are advising people, if this was to happen to you, this is where you go. If you're not happy for this information to go where, don't sign this, don't say this. I don't know at what point, but that's on the prevention agenda, and it's something that can be looked into.
Thank you so much. You started going into an area that I think my colleagues are going to talk to you a bit more about later on. So I'll hand back to you, Chair. I know we're short on time, but thank you all so much.
Thanks. Yeah, just to remind us that we've only got 23 minutes left for the next 3 sections. So everybody can be brief. Ken Skates.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. It's already been raised, the role of public bodies, but it'd be helpful just to have the views of you today with regard to the way in which public bodies, local authorities, obviously, but police, social services, health and education providers are supporting migrant women and girls who are victims and also survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. Are there ways that this could be enhanced? And do you think that social services are complying with the duties that are placed on them to meet the needs of migrant communities as set out in the Social Services and Wellbeing Act? I'm not sure who to begin with first. Perhaps Andrea, do you want to begin with this?
Yeah, thank you. We still do see people that fall through the cracks, and we see case studies where people have turned up to see their GP and they get turned away by reception staff. We did a training session with the Royal College of Physicians just before lockdown over 2 years ago, and it was a brilliant afternoon, but what we found was that at least 50% of people in the room had never heard of the nation of sanctuary, let alone all the rules around immigration. So there's still a lot of work to be done, and of course then there's the revolving door of staff that every organisation faces. So as soon as you train up one cohort, another cohort needs training. So it's an ongoing thing that needs more investment and support right across Wales. And as I mentioned, because of the widening of dispersal areas, there'll be more need to be done in the non-4 main cities as well.
Okay. Sarah, yes?
I'm going to be very brief. I think that it's a bit of a postcode lottery. I think we hear accounts of some social services departments that actually are complying with their duties, but Wanjiku's already made reference to occasions where that's not the case. I do think that Welsh Government has a role to play here in terms of reviewing what is done, looking at existing data of what's being done, looking at complaints and appeals. And I think one of the things that I wanted to highlight is to look at how often appeals are made and how often they are successful to decisions, and just to remind ourselves that the vast majority of people who receive an answer assume that is the correct answer. So most people don't appeal. So if you look at your appeals and are seeing a high percentage of success, you can reasonably assume that that means a vast number of people are actually being underserved. And I think that Welsh Government has a tremendous opportunity to scrutinise that more carefully, and to hold certainly devolved authorities, but also to work closely with non-devolved authorities to improve that. I will hand over to Wanjiku.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Ken, for that question. As my colleagues have said, it's very important that more training and that the Welsh Government takes a role on this. I'll just give a few examples of actual things that have happened. As I said, in most cases and in instances of domestic abuse, police are the first point of call, and we've seen real malpractices around this, where a few months ago, we had a situation where an asylum-seeking family was going through really horrible domestic abuse, where the perpetrator, and mostly due to his PSTD issues, real bad mental health there, and he threatened to kill the family, and he meant it. He was going to do it. And the police stand up and they said, oh, so the asylum seekers, what do we do with them? They left. They left them there. Nobody did anything until Bowser was called in the following day. The family had slept out of the house because they couldn't stay in the house with them, but police didn't know. So that training, and it's not just a one-off, it just continuous training, because we have police officers changing all the time. With local authorities, and we had this from the CIRIDA launch, the study they carried out in Wales, and they said all local authorities are sending all their referrals for migrant women, girls with Valdez issues to Bowser. But are the local authorities funding Bowser to carry out this work? again, it's an issue. We have had instances where women have not even been taken into refuge because of a language barrier, and refugees have said, oh, we're not able to support them through their language barrier. We can't give them support on a daily basis because of that language barrier. What's supposed to be done? We saying that local authorities should fund BME refugees in every county, or more refugees, BME specific refugees across Wales. We're looking at social services. Again, I gave that example before, I'm not going to repeat it again. Postcode Rotary, it's as to what people want to do at the time of the incident. So a lot of work needs to be done, but raising awareness, training is very crucial for a lot of the local authorities and other public bodies.
Okay, thanks for that. It's pretty obvious then what the Welsh Government perhaps could be doing or should be doing in terms of support, training, obviously the review that Sarah talked about concerning appeals, staff training, supporting staff, particularly issues around turnover. Are there any, just finally from me, are there any other areas in which the Welsh Government could be applying greater support? Sarah?
I guess I would sort of circle back to that that last resort fund, so that I think sometimes bad decisions are made because of lack of knowledge and lack of training or poor information sharing. I think sometimes those decisions are being impacted by resources. I think the idea that a refuge is turning someone away because they aren't able to provide translation services, in some ways that's a responsible choice because they know that somebody needs proper translation services. But that question comes down to resourcing. And central. Sorry.
Lovely. Thanks very much. That's all from me, Chair.
Very good. Thank you very much. Altaf Hussain, do you want to ask the questions you wanted to?
With regard to awareness and support these communities have, how much awareness is among them and what support do they have? Is there a way both awareness and support could be enhanced? I know you have answered many of the questions already, really. There is so much of overlap in them. I know there's a funding problem, language is a problem, but talking into the communities, to the communities' heads, have you been doing that as well? And what other things are there which can enhance the awareness and could be seen as you are supporting them?
I think, thank you, Ataf. I talked about awareness raising before and how important it is to the various migrant communities, raising awareness in the communities. But again, that is very difficult to run because you're talking of migrant communities where people are either working as bank workers, where they're called to work at odd different times. A lot of them in homes where they're not allowed to get out to talk to people. The reason they're victims of domestic abuse first and foremost is because they're under control of other people. And unfortunately for migrant victims of domestic abuse, sometimes it's whole families that have put them under this control. It's not just the one perpetrator. Sometimes it's a whole community. So if we're going to look for a way of raising awareness, this is again on the prevention agenda, we're going to go to spaces where these people attend, where people are allowed to go into readily. We go to mosques, we're going to churches, we're going to markets and places where we're going to meet these people, but we're not going to call them to focus group meetings and to coffee mornings they will not attend. So we have to innovate ways of reaching out to them. And again, sometimes through this prevention agenda, support is realized because somebody will be raising awareness at a certain spot and somebody will raise an issue about something that they're going through that they did not know was abuse, because that's the other issue with migrant people. Sometimes they may not know that they're going through domestic abuse or violence until somebody talks to them about it. So again, it's looking for ways of how this awareness raising can be carried out.
And you want to add anything?
Just to flag, we're coming to an end of a project that we're running in partnership with BALZO and Race Council Cymru at the moment, where we're giving out grants to Black, Asian, minority and ethnic community groups to enable them to deal with the effects of the pandemic. And as Wanjika was saying, that sometimes it's about having avenues into those communities where you're discussing other things and then use it as a side route in for more difficult conversations. But that grant programme is coming to an end, but funding programmes like that, which are specific and targeted, will help to provide more equity across the field.
Sarah, anything?
I think for me, Valdresvi, people seek support from the places that they trust first. And so the prevention agenda and awareness raising has to get into those spaces, not wait until people reach out of those spaces. And that has to be done at a grassroots level. So I would support everything my colleagues have said.
Thank you very much. Now, with regards to the current strategies, are you satisfied with them, especially with regards to these preventive measures? And do you think the Welsh Government should be doing more about these? And if they are, what are those preventive measures you would like to see?
Did you want to go first?
Andrea?
Oh. Unclear who wants to go first.
I think we all agree that we think Welsh Government is doing quite a bit already, and we're thankful for that in comparison to what's happening in some parts of England, specifically around asylum seekers and refugees. Wales is doing a whole lot more, and we're really grateful, but we still think there is more to be done, particularly around asylum seekers and refugees. From my avenue of everything that I'm seeing, people are just still falling through the cracks, and we can't wait. We need to take action now, particularly in light of the things that we've talked about, you know, the Nationality and Borders Bill, the hostile practices, the Ukraine crisis, the widening of dispersal areas. All of that means it's going to get worse. So if we wait any longer, we're storing up many more issues for the future.
I would agree with all of that. I would say that the Welsh Government have recently published, last week, week before, the Valdresvi strategy. The question has to constantly be, how are we embedding, not adding? It shouldn't be something that we check and add on afterwards. Addressing the needs of migrant women and migrant survivors is central. We need quality impact assessments done at the beginning, and we need to design in and take a margins to the centre approach, because if we cover the needs of the few, we will successfully cover the needs of the many. If we cover the needs of the many, the few will get left out. So taking a margins to the centre approach is always the way to go, and the way to do that is to ensure that every strand of the Valdresvi strategy is truly reflective of the needs of all of the citizens, even the migrant survivors who've not yet been offered gain citizenship in Wales.
Yes. Yeah.
Can I very quickly, just to add on to what my colleagues have said, is for the Welsh Government, and through that strategy, not to look at migrant women as a homogeneous group, because they're not, but it's to break down the various groups of people that are said to be migrants. We're looking at women who are on spousal visas. We're looking at asylum seeking families and women. We're looking after Eastern European victims of domestic abuse, and especially after Brexit and everything that has thrown onto us. We're looking at people on student visas. We're looking at victims of forced marriage. We're looking at victims of honor-based violence. We're looking at victims of female genital mutilation. What are we doing for each one of those groups? How are they represented within that strategy? I think one of the recommendations for us within the strategy was that when we're talking about Black and minoritized women, who are we talking about? Are the Eastern European people there, for example? Who are they? Who are we talking about? But I think there should be a breakdown on what we're looking to do or to support each one of those groups, because their needs are so different and varied depending on what background or visa they're coming here as.
Great, thank you very much.
Yeah, can I just follow up with it's a racing certainty that somebody who's coming to this country to seek asylum and fleeing persecution elsewhere will not be familiar with the law in this country. They just won't. Why should they be? So is it sort of at all part of the basic information provided to an asylum seeker or indeed somebody who's granted a work permit that, this is the basics of the law in this country around not being violent in our relationships?
That would be, thank you. That would be very helpful if that information was included there, because one of the things we find from working with people from different communities, there are countries and places where abuse is accepted. Indeed, we are told there are some parts, and I dare to say some parts of Africa where women think if the husbands are not beating them up physically, they don't love them as much as they should love them. So there should be that, and that just people spelling out, this is what is allowed in this country, this is what is not allowed. And it's a cultural conflict where that is so important and should be addressed at the point where people are getting their visa to come into the country, their work permit, when they've been admitted as asylum seekers. That information should be spelled out, and it would help a lot in dealing with perpetrators, because a lot of them act upon ignorance. They do not know that some of the things are not allowed.
Okay, thank you for that. Senedd Williams, would you like to come in, please?
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon. You've already touched on this in your previous response to Altaf Hussein's question, and Sarah, you mentioned the recent publication of the new VAWDA SV strategy for 2022-26. So I wanted your general views, first of all, on the strategy. Now, we've already mentioned some gaps in terms of the intervention and prevention agenda. We've already mentioned language barriers. We've also mentioned some deficiencies in terms of funding in certain areas, and perhaps this need for some kind of fund to assist those who have no recourse to public funds. So what are the gaps? You will have seen the strategy, and I'm sure you will have fed into it also, hopefully. So what are the gaps in your views, having read that new strategy?
So could you indicate who wants to go first?
So I suppose it's the issues that we've already discussed this afternoon. The things you want to see the Welsh Government, are you not confident that that's been covered in this strategy?
Wandika, are you getting the translation?
Yes, I just I just got that. Yeah, so with the strategy, the things that we had said, as I've mentioned, and thanks, Ina, there's some information that we had mentioned through the strategy that left out, first and foremost, it left out the support for women with no recourse to public funds, as you've mentioned that. It's still not very clear. The strategy is still not very clear on the support that we give to victims of violence. So if a woman comes to us and she's fleeing forced marriage, for example, what makes her case urgent? Because she's likely to be a victim of honor-based violence. So what do we do differently to make sure that we safeguarding that victim? Such things are not clear. We also felt that there was a lot left out on children. And when you talk about children, and especially when we're talking about children from migrant backgrounds, we talk about them being victims of witnessing domestic abuse that has happened within the parents. We talk about them as being victims of forced marriage, female genital mutilation, honor-based violence. How do we support them? How do we support children? Again, that's not very clear within the strategy, because those children that are going through those cultural specific abuse, they need to be supported differently. Children that are from asylum-seeking families, again, how do we support them? Children that have sought asylum in their own right, underage minors who've come into the country in their own right as asylum seekers and are placed in host families where they're abused. Again, all this is lacking in the strategy. So we felt that the strategy was very general and left out things that would have wanted to see, and we fed back to this, but that didn't seem to change when the strategy has been finalized. And also to do with I've just lost the point. Can I come back? And somebody talking, I'll come back to it. Something that...
Yeah, of course. Yeah, just codwch eich llaw. Yes,
of
Sarah?
course, just put your hand up when you're ready. Sarah.
For me, the strategy, I would concur with Wanjiku, it is imperfect. But the big thing is going to be about checking, getting disaggregated data, following up on the commitments within the strategy. As an example from the last strategy, we had commissioning guidance which was developed. But then was the follow-up done to ensure that that commissioning guidance was used? By whom was it used? Whether it was useful, effective, how it could be improved? So one of the things for me about the strategy is it has to be intention to action. It has to follow. And that check has to be made, not just so there are but some bits missing, and I think that's going to be developed within the blueprint approach. But it is the thing about we have to check what is happening and hold to account and celebrate where it is happening so that we can build on good practice. There is some outstanding practice in Wales. And there could be more outstanding practice if we could build on what is already being done well. If we were to take as first principles that idea of no woman left behind, of a nation of sanctuary that is looking after those who are hurt and harmed and providing proper supports and checking that that's happening and learning when it's not, we would be making great progress.
Ar hynny, oes modd I o'n mynd I ofyn...
On that, I was actually going to ask about this. Are there any examples of best practice in Wales or beyond Wales? We did mention Scotland earlier, of course, but are there specifics that you could point to that we should be learning from?
Yeah, I'll bring Andrea. Na, doedd Andrea mewn gynta wedyn.
I'll bring Andrea in first and then I'll come to you, Wanjiku.
Yeah. Andrea?
Thank you. One of the things we've talked about is how do we get to those that may not feel a part of a community or maybe isolated. And so one of our projects is called Asylum Guide that we run. It's funded by Refugee Action, and I think it's funded by Comic Relief originally. And essentially we fund up people that are in the asylum system to guide others going through the asylum system. So it's that peer-to-peer coaching, mentoring and support. And that helps to break down those trust barriers and to help people integrate quicker. It's a fairly small project, but we'd be happy to share how well it's going with you.
Diolch. Wanjiku, mind y mewn?
Thank you. I was going to talk about the pilot that we're currently running that is funded by the Home Office, which is funding for migrant victims of domestic abuse who have no recourse to public funds. And while I've said that it's very limited and restricted in the way that it only pays so much and it's not paying for the in-cost. It's not paying for all the support that a victim of domestic abuse who has no recourse to public funds needs. But also, it's a big step towards the support. And indeed, we supported 85 women from that funding last year. If that could be improved on, it's a really good example of how a good fund can work and the difference that it will make to support women. Within that, I supported one young person who was a young girl who would not be picked up by the social services because she's only 18 with no children, a single girl that had to leave home because she was being abused by her own father. But because she had no recourse to public funds, being an asylum seeker, there was no fund in the country to support her, and she was turned away by refugees and other places of support that she went to. We managed to support girl and put her in a safe place and also help her with her immigration case. And that's one of the things that this project is doing, is to support people through the immigration legal cases. So, and again, that's not funded by the project. We're doing it in kind to support them through that. But if such a project is well funded, and from a Welsh perspective, it would really be helpful.
Just one final question. I know that we're almost out of time, but I do think this is very important. I think it's something that struck us all as members of this committee in hearing from those people affected by this violence. And I just wanted to ask you specifically to what extent you feel migrant women and girls have been involved in the development of the Fawda SV strategy, particularly given what we've discussed in terms of issues around not wanting to share data and so on. Are you content that those voices have been heard beyond the focus groups that we know these women and girls often don't want to be involved with?
If I could answer that and say that within Bowser, we've tried our best to involve women who are former service users, people that we supported, and we've tried as much as possible to get them onto our board once they're able to be confident to do that. We've allowed them to come in as workers, support workers themselves. We work with them in different ways. We include them in our interview groups. So we try our best to do that, but and that's really helpful. But the actual people who are going through these incidents now, people that are victims right now, who are afraid to give information for fear of their data being shared, there are still a lot that have been left out.
Sarah,
Sarah, did you want to come in there?
I think that point has already been captured. Those people who are left out, we must make great efforts, and particularly bearing in mind that there is an intention to have a survivor scrutiny panel that sits alongside the implementation of the strategy. We cannot possibly succeed, but we must make best efforts to get the voices of current experience to get those voices in there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Andrea, we look forward to seeing that asylum guide, the peer asylum guide that you mentioned, as well as any specific evidence you have of inappropriate data sharing where the person has not given informed consent. Other than that, I'd like to thank all of you for your really useful evidence this afternoon. And I just want to emphasize the importance of you reading the transcript of your evidence to make sure that we've captured your information correctly, and obviously you can correct it. And otherwise, to thank you very much indeed for your participation in this session. So thank you, Andrea Cleaver, Sarah Katzpatrick, and Wanjuko Ngotho Mbugwa. Thank you so much indeed for all everything you're doing for people who need your help. Thank you very much. So we're now going to take a short break, and we will resume the evidence session at 10 to 3, just to give people time to turn around. Okay. Welcome back to the second evidence session on domestic violence, violence against women and sexual violence in the migrant community. This is our second session. I'm very pleased to welcome Joanne Hopkins from Public Health Wales and Naomi Elaine from the Welsh Local Government Association. In our informal private sessions with asylum seekers and other people who have no recourse to public funds because of their immigration status, we've had some very good examples of people dealing with situations appropriately, and then obviously we also hear about situations that are not dealt with appropriately. So I wondered if you could just sum up what are the main challenges for public services when faced by migrant women and girls who present as victims or survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, and what are the gaps as far as public services are concerned. So which one of you would like to go first? Jo, do you want to make a start?
I will do. Thank you, Jenny. So I think for me, in terms of some of the research that we've done in Public Health Wales and the ACE Support Hub, I think the outstanding challenge for all of this is the barrier of language and the barrier of not understanding perhaps the meaning of how things are communicated, both in terms of how it's done visually, but also the use of language. So when you have somebody who's translating, that literal meaning might not be communicating what they're intended to say in terms of the use of the language. And I think we see that as coming up over and over again in terms of accessing any services, but particularly difficult when it comes to accessing services around domestic abuse and sexual violence, because there is also, I think, in many cultures a real difficulty in trying to articulate what that actually has been in terms of an experience, and also around some of the bits that are linked to that, so that the actual act of violence itself might be something that can be communicated, but the experience of it, including the impact of mental health, may not be recognised by the people who've experienced it in the first place, because we know that there is a large amount of stigma still in the UK around mental health, let alone in countries where it's not even discussed in any sort of public services. But then secondly, if there is a recognition that there is an ill health consequence of the violence that they may have suffered, often that is described as something that manifests in a physical form. So people will describe pain, people will describe more physical sort of health impacts without necessarily describing mental health, because they don't understand that that's the consequence of it. So I think there's a huge issue there around being able to communicate in a way that not only explains what's happened to that individual, but also in a way that gets them the help that they actually need. Because being unable to articulate for whatever reason what exactly is going on, I think is one of the big challenges. Then it comes to the challenges of public service in accessing interpreters to enable that discussion, accessing interpreters that perhaps need to be of a specific gender. So we often talk, particularly over the years in the Uncharted Territory reports, which I'm sure Naomi will mention in a minute, around the need to have some choice and empowerment within this process, for women in particular to be able to say that they would prefer to have a female interpreter or a female interviewer, or however they're engaging with public services. And even if that's available, sometimes it can only be made available if possible. So there's always an every chance to try and subscribe to this, but actually in reality, are there enough interpreters? Are there enough people who are able to facilitate that conversation in that way? So I think that's, for me, is the second element of this. And actually, what was really interesting around some of the work that we did when we just started, when I say we, in partnership with the Welsh Strategic Migration Partnership, Public Health, the Home Office and the Welsh Government, thinking about, you know, what we could do to better facilitate access, in particular to healthcare, and sort of making assumptions around, well, you know, all Syrian people will want to have a Syrian interpreter to speak Arabic. Oh, that's not the case. And actually, in some cases, it became a real challenge because people were quite frightened about who might be the person that has been brought into that conversation and where their allegiances might be. So I think the other thing is around perhaps not having enough understanding and cultural depth to our understanding so that we make those assumptions perhaps without realising basically the consequences of them. So that lack of understanding at that sort of level of depth about people's experience. And then I think the last, which kind of barriers and gaps of intertwined here, I'm afraid, sorry, I just realised, but one of the last things I wanted to say on this as well, I think, is that there is something that's come out in, particularly in the Uncharted Territory reports, but also in some of the more recent work around if the experience of sexual violence in particular has taken place in conflict in another country, actually there's no real justice outcomes that are being sought in this country, in Wales. So actually getting access to support is quite difficult when it's just the experience you're talking about that's happened somewhere else. There's no justice outcome that can be kind of met. So here is a group of people who are asking for help for something that hasn't happened in the UK, and I think that in itself is quite difficult for lots of services to get their heads around, actually, in terms of, well, it's not here, it hasn't happened here, so therefore we understand that there might be an impact in terms of your health, or might, you know, in terms of sexual health or something like that. But the kind of proximity of it, I think, is different, and I think for me that's something that we haven't really engaged with properly in terms of how public services understand the experiences that people have had before they've come to the UK, perhaps on the way to the UK, and then compounded perhaps by being in relationships in the UK that you know are still where they are being abused or subject to violence. I'll pause there.
Thank you. I mean, you both represent the everyday frontline services that somebody might be accessing, things like school, you know, the education service, the public transport service, the housing, health. How prepared are people to pick up hidden signs or key indicators that that this individual, who you may never see again otherwise, is somebody who needs to, you know, there needs to be a further conversation to establish the extent of the vulnerability of that person. Naomi, do you want to just, if you can just summarise how it's a difficult subject, regardless of immigration status. So how well do you think people are aware of the vulnerability of people who have a complicated immigration status?
Thank you, and good afternoon to all of you. And in short, I think the response to that is varied, but let me come back to that if you like. Firstly, I'd like to give the apologies of Anne Hubbard, who couldn't be here this afternoon. And Joe has already mentioned Uncharted Territories a couple of times, and Anne was the instigator of that and has been a huge advocate for addressing issues affecting migrant women around violence against women. So Anne's on leave, but I know that she has submitted some written evidence to the committee. I think one of the biggest challenges, and it does come back to your question as well, Jenny, around the indicators, but one of the biggest barriers is the complexity of the issue that we're dealing with here. Mm-hmm. So that there are different groups of women with different immigration statuses that have come to our attention for different reasons. And each of those is complex because each of those cases, as you all know, will be down to an individual, but it's not always easy to understand different immigration status and then what the entitlements are for public services. So I think there is that difficulty there. And then we're also talking about many different forms of violence against women in this setting. And I was lucky enough to capture the end of the last session that you had, so I won't repeat all the forms of violence that I know were identified. but being able to look at that as a whole and address that does need much more focused attention. The point was made in the last group that migrant women are not a homogenous group, and understanding the differences and then the entitlements and what people can access and what their services are, I think is complex. It's not easy, and particularly for some of the areas across Wales that don't deal with these issues on a regular basis. So being able to understand what that, where the support services are, not only what's available, but how you access that is also a concern. So I think that does bring us back to the points that Joe was talking about around the indicators. And if you look at some of the individual issues or forms of violence that can occur, there are different levels of awareness. So if you look at issues around modern slavery or trafficking, there is more awareness, and there has been sessions done, and there's a lot of that around what those indicators are that people need to look at and be able to investigate. Whether the same has been done in some of the other specific areas at the same level of awareness across all public services is probably not as well trailed, I guess, as you would want, because I know we'll come on to things like the National Training Framework, but covering these issues as part of a broader session doesn't give the depth of understanding, I think, that is required given the complexity of the issues. So I think those indicators are there, as Joe was saying, and I do remember many moons ago, how people will vocalise or communicate the issues isn't always as upfront as where people will pick up on those. So I think there is a lot more awareness that is needed, but also some support, because in some instances you can do training, you can do awareness raising, but staff move on. It's not a one-off event. It needs to be something that's much more ongoing in terms of not only built into existing programmes, but specialist programmes as well, I think, for those that are required. So I think there is still some more work to be done across the range of the violence that can appear and the different immigration status, so that people can identify those indicators. Sorry, that was a bit long.
No, it was a really interesting answer. We'll now go and explore. Oh, Jane Dodds, before I move to Sarah Murphy.
Just a real quickie. Joe, you mentioned about access to translators, and we heard a lot about this in our evidence to date. What resources are available to health bodies and health authorities to provide their own translators and interpreters?
As I understand it, we still have the WIT service, which is we can access a group of interpreters that are part of almost like a bank of interpreters. But there's also things like Language Line, things where you can dial up and speak to people that translate it almost on the phone, which is what certainly, I should confess, I used to work in the Home Office, so that's certainly what we used in the Home Office for that sort of interaction. But I think that the trouble with all of this is that, and particularly COVID hasn't helped, I have to say, is that a lot of translation is not just about the words, it's about how you communicate, it's about how sometimes you can use visual cues for that sort of thing, and translators will be looking for that in someone's face and their eyes and their interaction around that. And even if you don't understand the language, I think there's a lot that can be picked up from seeing how someone expresses it. So that's where the nuance of it is lost. So I'm not saying that there isn't interpretation available at all. What I'm saying is I think that when it's done in the best way that we can, there is still barriers for people to be able to communicate exactly what their requirements are, so their needs are absolutely met. But I think we've come a long way, and I think there's been a lot of understanding now about the need for being more trauma informed in the way that we are engaging with people and asking them what they would like, what they need. So do you need a male interpreter? Do you need a female interpreter? Do you need a particular dialect? Would it be better if it was somebody who came from your own country, or perhaps a different one, from what I just said about nervousness, sometimes about who interpreters are employed by and what information will be used for. So, and that can go much wider than the interpretation service. I think there's a lot of mistrust within migrant communities around public services, full stop, because you might mean including the health service, but wider than that, are mistrusted, are seen as agents of the state, and therefore it's very difficult for people to kind of step back from that and start to trust suddenly people who previously they wouldn't have done. So all of this added together creates a very difficult environment for somebody to be able to talk about something so personal when actually it's sort of layered on with personal shame plus community shame, everything else that might impact on that at the same time. Would it be all right if I just mentioned just quickly, because you mentioned schools, Jenny? I went to visit, and I'm not just calling out this school because it's, you know, it's the only school that does this. I'm sure there's many examples, but I went to visit Pill Primary a year or so ago. And here is an example of how those indicators are picked up. You know, you have engagement not only with the child in front of you, but with the family. I had a really good discussion about, at the time, some Middle Eastern families and some Eastern European families who were all in the same classroom, had very different needs, had very different experiences. And yet, you know, that was being well thought through, and they were working with the family as a whole. So I think there's some really, really strong examples in schools in Wales of where, particularly in those areas who are dispersal areas who have got a lot of experience in this, as Naomi says, perhaps there are other areas who haven't had to engage in this way, but could learn a lot from the really good examples that we've got across Wales of how this works well.
Thank you. And I know Sarah Murphy wants to pick up on some of the complexities and challenges of this area. Sarah.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you both for being here today. I wanted to ask some questions about immigration status and data sharing. We've, you know, like as you said, you watched earlier on some sessions, so it's a kind of a follow-on from that, and to get an understanding from you to what extent you were aware of data sharing between frontline services like local authorities, police, social services and health, and the Home Office, and what you think the impact of that is potentially. Who would like to go first? Joe?
Thank you. Naomi's nodding at me. I think, again, I mean, I better qualify my experience in this before we start. So for 20 years, I worked for the Home Office, and for the last 10 years of that in Wales. So I do have experience of working in immigration for a very, very long time from that side of the fence. And then for the last 3 years, I've been working at Public Health Wales. So I'll try not to conflate the two experiences and be very clear which one I'm talking about. But I think to start with, I think there is an improved set of data now than perhaps we had maybe 10, 15 years ago. It is complex. We talk about section 95, 98, 4, you know, all these different kind of bits of language and not necessarily what does that mean. However, I think we certainly have a better picture across Wales of who people are, and as far as we can, where they are, because people move. And even if they are in a dispersal area, you know, they can still leave. So as far as we know, as far as we can do that, I think we do have a picture. In terms of data sharing, I think that's where it gets more difficult, because people, as Naomi's already said, you know, have you know, it's complex immigration status, and you can change status. You know, so one minute you've got no rights and entitlements, perhaps if you're in the asylum system, the next minute you have a whole load of them, and that change can happen very quickly, and it's very difficult for people to understand themselves perhaps what's happened and how they need to adjust to that, let alone everybody else who's trying to work out, you know, what bit of paper they should have that makes them suddenly this and then another. I think the other problem with data sharing as well is that those agencies who need to know about the status of somebody in order to work out what they're entitled to will be looking very much for those sorts of, you know, sets of data that says this is what they are. You know, they are either an asylum seeker or they're a refugee or they're a migrant or whatever. But that's not how they necessarily might see themselves. So when they're accessing services, they may not describe themselves as, you know, coming from that subsection of this area. Actually, data on you know, ethnicity and nationality is quite patchy as well. And it's not to say it's not there, but it's not consistently collected in a way that perhaps we can really understand how people are accessing services and how they're moving between them. So I think from my perspective, I think there's a lot been done to improve data collection. How we then synthesize that and understand how people move through different systems is where this is more complicated. So, and it's not just related to migrants, I don't think. You know, we have this issue around, you know, in public health, we say, you know, make every contact count, don't we? But we can only do that if we know where in the system people are and what contacts they are what they're having, and I think that's where the kind of difficulty comes in here. So it's laying data over data, synthesizing and analyzing that data and understand what it's telling us. And I think for me, that's where the challenge lies. We're better at collecting it, we're just not so good at collectively analysing it.
Just to kind of focus a bit on what people have said about that fear, and you know, is there, from your perspective, is there a legal duty for those frontline services to share that data with the Home Office?
From what I recall, and I'm no longer an expert in this, when we were thinking about what's the most important thing for people, is it to access healthcare? Is it to make sure that they are, you know, if they have COVID, that they come forward and are able to access the support they need and we're able to treat them? Or is it that we then give information to the Home Office about who they are and where they are? So I think in certain circumstances, there is a legal obligation in terms of, and it's quite complex, all of this. But I also think, you know, in terms of humanity, we need to think about the person who's presented in front of us, and how does that you know, weigh up in terms of that legality. So you have what you absolutely have to do, and then we have the decisions that we've made based on, you know, those kind of greater risks, I guess, to public health, where we've said actually it's more important that you come forward and you have a vaccination, or you come forward and you know, you're able to access the support you need, and we will not be sharing that data. I think the fear element of it is that lack of understanding about what that data will then be used for. So we still have a real concern, I think, in a number of, particularly in hearing from third sector services, around any form of data, even, you know, personal data, names, that sort of thing. Where is that going to go? They have a real fear that it will go to immigration and therefore they're going to end up being deported or whatever. But I think there is also a bigger piece of work that's needed here to really communicate what actually happens versus that overarching fear of what might happen. Because I think from memory, as I say, I'm not an expert in this, but I did have a look at where there are elements of legal duty and all the rest of it. If you think somebody is working that shouldn't be working, that sort of angle to it, then I think it needs to be much clearer, because if you're able to understand what the data is there from, where it's going, it won't support everybody. But I think it's just really difficult, and for someone like me to try and go and have a look and see if I can find out exactly where it says there's this legal duty, and I found it difficult at the time. I think that lack of transparency is really key.
Thank you so much. And I hadn't even considered what you said about needing people to come forward for vaccines, for example. So that's really interesting. I wonder if afterwards you could follow up with our team. It would be really interesting to know if there is a clear policy on whether or not you can refuse. And also if there is, as you said, a process in place where that decision is made and how that decision is made. That would be really interesting, I think, for us to do.
We may need to go to the Home Office for clarity on the legality question, I think, because as far as I remember, Naomi may correct me, that it does sit in their policy and legislation. However, I can send to the committee a leaflet that we produced in collaboration with the Strategic Migration Partnership and others, which was produced during COVID and given to all families all people actually that were accommodated by Clear Springs Ready Homes during the COVID pandemic, and when we were in the first round of restrictions, where it said very, very clearly, you will not be, your information will not be given to immigration. You can come forward and you can access healthcare. I think that's an example of that.
Obviously, because as a committee, we can ask the Home Office that. I suppose what's helpful for our committee is to know that public bodies and agencies, there are Welsh public bodies and agencies. We need to know if you believe that you can refuse, if you have refused, and why you've refused. And if that's something that because if they're not, that's something that we need to know about. Thank you so much. Naomi, is there anything you just wanted to add to any of that?
Naomi's on mute.
Yeah, I was waiting to come off mute. Just picking up on that point, I think that lack of clarity around the requirements. So sometimes people share the information because they think they need to, but there's not necessarily that lack of clarity as to when and where. So I think that would be helpful to confirm that. In terms of some of the data, I mean, I think even in terms of the collection of monitoring data, we don't ask for immigration status. So, you know, there's a lack of information, if you like. So you may know around the number of Black and minority ethnic people within an area, but you won't necessarily know immigration status. And again, some of that referral information may not pick up, but that fear of what could happen should their information get into the hands of people who can make decisions around whether they stay in the UK or not, and a view that being a victim will actually work against them rather than you know, not affect their status, I think is a real concern. I think one of the things that I did want to mention when I was looking at this is actually just understanding that the cohort of people who might be caught by being migrants will continue to grow. So you'll be aware, obviously, we've talked about refugees and asylum seekers within that, but there will be an increase of the number of asylum seekers in Wales as the Home Office has made a decision to move to full dispersal. So all areas of Wales will have asylum seekers who don't necessarily have asylum seekers now. And I think that leads into us needing to get some of this information and the data sharing right at the beginning, if you like. And as you were talking, I was thinking one of the processes that does work well around data sharing is the national referral mechanism for modern slavery. And maybe we do need some other very clear frameworks and pathways of where that data and information sharing should go. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but whether there's something as effective as the NRM is an issue. It's just, again, how we can learn from things that are working in practice here. So that we can address the issues and support people.
Thank you so much. That's a wonderful idea as well. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Moving on then to Jane Dodds.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'd like to ask you specifically around whether you feel the services in Wales meet the needs of women and girls who have experienced violence and need support. Thank you.
I mean, I'll pick up on this, but Joe's just done some recent research. I thought I'd take that one first, Joe. I think one of the issues is obviously the particular concern around those that are presented with no recourse to public funds, and you know, the ability of services to provide appropriate support to people in that circumstance. And while some of the guidance is clearer, obviously there's still some hesitation or lack of confidence around applying some of that legislation within the circumstances. So I think that probably leads on to the issues around awareness raising, you know, and again, as I said earlier, it's not just the awareness raising, it's the ongoing support that we are providing to people to be able to provide that ongoing support. So I don't think there's enough specialist services across Wales in terms of that meeting the needs of migrant women at the moment, even in terms of the women aid groups, and they will do as best as they can in terms of linking up those services. But BAWSO is really only that real service that can provide an all Wales basis. But again, the resources that it has as an organisation does need to be looked at in terms of being able to provide services to areas that may not have been its usual cohorts in the past. So I think, you know, some of the work, and that's supported by organisations like Barnardo's and other third sector bodies. So, you know, people will provide what support they can, but in terms of having clear sort of referral mechanisms, support specialists, and often when Joe was talking around the interpreters, you know, it is needed 24/7. So one of the issues around the interpreters, and we found recently with people from Ukraine, is making sure that you have enough interpreters that can provide the vast variety of services that are required at the time that you need it. So there are useful feedbacks, but also then people sometimes wanting interpreters outside of Wales, making sure that there's that distinction with any link back in communities. So there are a lot of sort of those kind of tips, if you like, that we need to make sure that those services meet the needs of the individuals at the time. But I think generally there is a need for sort of further investment in some of those specialist services across Wales, not expecting them in all local authority areas, but being able to know where they can access those support, and that there will be enough support for them. So I'm sure Joe can pick up on that as well.
Naomi, I was going to mention, I'm sure you've heard it mentioned before, if you haven't, you will hear it mentioned, the report that was launched on the 24th of May, the Birmingham University report, which is Professor Jenny Philimore's, and what that kind of really puts really starkly, I think, is what we kind of already knew, is that there is a huge reliance on BAWSO in Wales to provide services for this group. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing in terms of BAWSO as an organisation, but I think what we do need is certainly more sustainable funding for this, but not just relying on one organisation to deliver it in a national programme. There are others that might do it more locally, but I think, you know, there is every organisation I think that they spoke to as part of that piece of work kind of said, well, we just refer to BAWSO because we don't do it ourselves, we have to refer on. So that's an enormous amount of pressure on one organisation. I think more sort of generally that there is also, back to this kind of, we shouldn't put everybody into one homogenous group. The needs of people who've experienced any form of violence, sexual violence, whatever it is, are really usually quite diverse and quite complex. So this is not about saying we just have an organisation that deals with migrants. This is more about saying, where are the opportunities to look at how people who have a migrant background or displaced people, however you might want to call them, whatever they might call themselves, how they can access the support that they need. And it may be that that's mental health support. It may be that that's perhaps support around parenting. It may be support to leave their abusive partner. Or it may be something that they might need many years down the line from the event actually happening. All of those things, I think, need to be really thought about. And there's a lot of work going on at the moment with Traumatic Stress Wales, to think, which Anne Hubbard is also leading, to think about that more acute response, I think, to what migrant women might need, where they are presenting with sort of symptoms that put them in that sort of area where we're talking about maybe complex PTSD or something like that. So there's some real work going on there at the moment. But my concern now, and if we just talk about Ukraine for a second, people coming here who are still in shock. They have just experienced something or are still experiencing something. We may not see the consequences of that, and they may not understand the needs they might have until many months down the line. We know, often that even in any circumstance, a survivor of domestic abuse will not ask for help, immediately. We're talking, 33, I think there's the stat from, I'll see if I can find it for you, I think from Safe Lives, it's 33 average incidents before anybody even says that something's happening to them. So if you add in the additional barriers that migrant women face, then we're talking about services that might need to pick up the pieces a lot further down the line. So for me, it's a more holistic issue.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I'm still a little bit clear, Joe, in your response. So do you actually feel that there needs to be more resources, more support services for migrant women in particular experiencing violence, which is what this committee is looking at? What you do. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, I do. Because I think, to have it just with one is not enough.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Very good, thank you very much. Ken Skate, would you like to come in and have a look at the policy and legislative framework that we're all operating under?
For attending, how can the policy and funding framework be amended or changed in Wales to improve the availability and provision of specialist services for migrant women and girls?
So I'll jump in, Joe, if you want. Okay. I think obviously the Welsh Government has recently launched their refreshed violence against women sexual violence strategy, and reviewing that this morning in light of the conversation that we were having today. And, I think that a lot of the strategies and the plans are there for tackling violence against women and sexual violence. But if you look through the lens of migrant women, does it cover them in that range of issues? So when I was reviewing the objectives of the strategy this morning, each of them needs to be looked at through the lens of migrant women. And as Joe said, when not talking about the homogenous group, but being able to break down some of the different experiences there as well. So there's the strategy, and there's the Nation of Sanctuary plan as well. So how these interact, and I think very shortly Welsh Government will also launch their race equality plan for Wales. So there are a lot of strategies and plans that do have an impact or an input into this area. I think one of the issues for me is around the implementation gap we often talk about in Wales, that the strategies and the plans, the direction of travel is very clear, but actually in terms of implementing, there does need to be increased training on an ongoing basis, different services that people can report to, awareness raising with migrant women themselves, but public services as well. So I think the strategies and plans are there. It's now how we turn some of that into reality, but also ensure that the needs of migrant women are addressed, because often we're talking about generic strategies and plans and expecting those strategies and plans to pick up all the different issues that affect different groups of people within that. So I think there is still some more to be done. I think what I would say is that coming out of this, and it's often a dual track, that we do need to mainstream the issues affecting migrant women into our existing plans, our existing strategies, our existing implementation plans, but we also need to look at where those gaps are at the moment. So you'll need a dual line to look at some of those specific sort of steps that are required to bring and inform people, if you like, and make sure that migrant women receive the same quality of service that we expect other women to receive when they are reporting such issues. So I think some of that work does need to be looked at through the lens of migrant women and the issues affecting migrant women, which might lead us then to some different actions that do need to take place to specifically meet the objectives then of those strategies and plans.
Great, thank you. Joe?
I come in?
Yeah, please.
Thank you. Yes, so I think this really is the crux of the Public Health Wales consultation feedback, actually, towards the strategy consultation. We were very concerned that we didn't see upfront a reference to displaced people in the broad sense, migrant women, refugees or asylum seekers, and we were very clear that we felt that was an important thing that still hasn't been included in the way that we had hoped. And the reason for that, I think, is that a number of the reports that we've done have highlighted the fact that in the Nation of Sanctuary plan there is a section that talks about Fawr SV, but those sort of recommendations and actions are actually quite old now. I mean, they're a couple of years old. There isn't real reference in the new strategy to this group, although it does mention, I think in one line, the Nation of Sanctuary plan will pick that up. I think there is a risk here that migrant women will fall down the cracks of all these plans. There isn't that bit that brings this all together. And I completely understand, having worked in government, how difficult it is to break down those policy silos. But here is a group that's falling between those silos, because as Naomi said, there is such an opportunity to look at this from a number of different angles, a number of different plans, a number of different policies, and yet each one refers to each other without really taking ownership of this. And I wondered whether, and it's an ongoing conversation, but I did wonder whether, you know, that point I made earlier about, because this violence has often happened outside of the UK or on the journey to the UK, that kind of separates this group slightly from us thinking, as we should do, you know, nobody should ever experience this form of violence. And I just think that there's probably a little bit more work to do, as evidenced in a number of these reports, to join that up and then join up with the UK government as well, in terms of how does this, because it's quite interesting that there was a whole section on migrant refugee women in the VALG strategy, the one before last, and it completely disappeared. And we can see the political kind of change of view and why that's happened, but we shouldn't, in Wales, I don't think, follow suit. There's an opportunity here to think about the legislation that already exists, the Social Services and Wellbeing Act, and how we can use that to facilitate perhaps more support for people who are NRPF, for example. So I think there's a real opportunity here that we could choose to take by thinking more in that sort of joined up way across the strategies and plans.
Great, thank you. I'm conscious of time. Just one question to the both of you regarding Welsh Government support. To what extent do you think that Welsh Government could support those who have no recourse to public funds? And what are the key challenges and barriers? And then specifically to Naomi, to what extent do you think social services across Wales have complied with the duties placed on them to meet the needs of migrant communities as set out in the Social Services and Wellbeing Act? And what more could Welsh Government do to help social services?
Shall I start, Naomi? Because I've got quite a quick response on this.
Please,
and I think
thank you.
Probably got, thanks. Welsh Women's Aid produced a really helpful paper that they put to Welsh Government, and I think, you know, commending that we take forward some real thinking around where are the opportunities within the Social Services and Wellbeing Act to provide services to people that is within the power of Welsh Government, and perhaps not to immediately push back and say, well, it's not in our power. And I think that's what that paper was testing. Are we absolutely sure that, you know, there aren't areas of devolved power that we could use to support particularly women in this group? I think, you know, there are examples across the UK of where there have been specific organisations or activities or pilots to test how we could do things differently. And I think the ask is, could we do that here? Could we think about perhaps funding for specific places, really just kind of see if we can test those boundaries? And I do think that the conversations at the steering group that were set up, we're trying to do that. We're trying to think about where are the red lines for the UK government? Could we ask them, or if we would be able to, and what would be the things that we absolutely couldn't do, but where are the areas that we could test a bit more? And for me, I think that would be a really groundbreaking area for us to have a look at, because yes, there are things that are the red lines, of course there are, but I don't think we're clear enough yet about what opportunities that we might have to do more for this group. And I think Anne, through the network, the NRPF network and other areas, would be able to help us to think more about that with that steer. So I'm hopeful from the steering group that there is that opportunity to take this forward. But I'm just keen, because it comes up in every report, as I've mentioned before, that this is the group that's a real concern, that have no access to anything. Yeah.
Thank you. Naomi.
Thank you. Picking up the first question around what support Welsh Government provides, I think there is a very clear vision for asylum and migration in Wales, which is around making sure Wales is seen as a nation of sanctuary, and we provide that welcome and support. But and obviously similar around violence against women. I think again it just comes back to where some of this meshes and what support and guidance and, you know, funding to make it happen, I think happens at the local level. So I think that there's a lot that we can build on here in terms of those commitments and areas. Welsh Government have a task force around refugee and migration issues where this kind of conversation should be able to be vocalised and seen. In terms of social services and the duties in terms of the Act, I mean, Welsh Government provided some detailed guidance around no recourse to public funds and the interaction with the Social Services Act. Sorry, I can't remember if it was pre-pandemic or during the pandemic. My timing has gone over the last 2 years. But there is some guidance out there that was developed in conjunction with social services and the third sector to ensure that it was very clear in terms of what those duties are. I think it is a work in progress. In terms of further work is required, which is supported by the No Recourse to Public Funds network. And again, it does come back to, in some local authority areas, this isn't something they're dealing with on a regular basis. So it's something that it's newer to them, and they will require that guidance and support from elsewhere to just help them through the system. But again, following those duties. But I do understand, particularly because I read around this subject, that's, I think it was Welsh Women's Aid, I think, was saying that sometimes that those duties are still not taken forward in the same way that they would like to see, or that somebody says, oh, it's domestic abuse, it doesn't fall within the guise of the Act. So again, I think that there are there are some bits that we can do further in terms of raising that awareness, making sure that people are understanding, and obviously you'll be aware of what Welsh Government did under no recourse or changing the no recourse to public fund with homelessness. So what are the opportunities there? And I do understand that they have launched a fund, Welsh Government, that would ask people to donate funding, which again could support other bodies like third sector bodies who are providing that support to no recourse to public funds. One of the issues of concern that I know shouldn't be the way, but you'll be aware that for money that's spent by authorities to support people with no recourse to public funds, we don't get that back. And there's never been a real opportunity to put a figure on what that is in Wales. There's some similar work that has been done in England. So I think we do need, as governments, if you like, at all levels, to be very clear around that no recourse to public funds, but being able to look at the kind of support we should be, and we are able to, and to make sure that that's provided. So I think it is a work in progress. I think in short, Ken, still further work to be done. But some of that is in train, but that doesn't mean that not having continual awareness sessions and newsletters that go out that remind staff around that, particularly for those areas that don't deal with these issues on a more regular basis.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. And Alka, if you wanted to come in on this area of awareness about what people's entitlement is.
I think they have a lot of things there. Let's go through it again.
Alka, at the moment you're breaking up, so I don't know if you could perhaps get a little closer to the microphone, and hopefully that will help.
About the awareness of the violence against women and domestic sexual violence and support among migrant communities, is there any demand for improvement, and how could this be enhanced to help these migrant communities? I know you have answered many of these, but let's go through it again.
I mean, I think Joe was saying earlier some of the issues for women in the migrant community, and how we do raise awareness, not only that, domestic abuse, the violence that people can experience is wrong, but also what is available. So I think there is more work to be done with the migrant communities themselves in terms of, acceptable forms of behaviour, but, how to challenge that and how to challenge it in a safe way, or where to go for that safety. But I think the awareness raising does need to be made with public bodies as well, as I've said earlier, because violence against women, sexual violence as an issue, has raised, its profile over the last few years has increased significantly, and there's been much more work to tackle that, but not necessarily in terms of some of the other experiences that women can have at different times. So I would support that need to make more awareness of it. But also, we haven't talked about children and young people, so we will have more unaccompanied asylum-seeking children arriving in Wales. And again, often people's journeys to the UK, their immigration status does make them more vulnerable to that victimisation, both in terms of the journeys of people coming. So, we know that there are some women who would have arrived unaccompanied asylum-seeking children that may have been assaulted through their journey. So there is different ways that we do need to raise awareness so that we can ensure that public services can be sensitive to the needs of those groups.
Jimmy, you want to add anything?
Thank you. I missed the beginning of the question, but I think Naomi's coloured that in for me now in terms of what you might have asked. So hopefully I've picked it up. But what I was going to say was we've been doing quite a lot of work in the ACE Support Hub recently to try and understand better the engagement with communities, so that someone like me should not go barreling into a community and say you should do this, that and the other. That's not going to work. So how do we work with communities themselves to have that conversation about what is it that's needed? How do we work with whether it's community leaders or whether it's with people who feel disempowered? And when I say we, all of us, not myself, not somebody over there. So communities don't feel that they're feeling threatened by yet another person from a public service coming in and telling them what to do. we had a really interesting conversation with a lady from Butte Town, who was telling me about, stop talking about us as if we're over there. You need to come down and visit. You need to come down, which was another side of it. Well, here's me barreling in now. No, you're coming to talk with me, and I can help you, and we can talk about this. And then I will go forward with the message if I understand it. So it's a really different way of engaging, isn't it? Rather than just saying, right, we'll give you a leaflet, or we'll come down and hope that you've understood everything that's been told and go away again. It's got to be done over time, and it's got to be done in a very careful and collaborative way, which actually would mean someone like me, I think, stepping out of the way and letting others come into that space and say, this is how we should do it. So one of the big kind of learning points, I think, from the COVID experience was that for the people that were even more marginalised than they were before were the ones that it's more of a community-led response. It's more of an oral history. It's more of a, we need to talk about this. We don't want a leaflet. We don't understand a leaflet. That's not anything that we're interested in. Actually, we want to access services by having a conversation about it. And I think that, for me, when people weren't able to do that, was marginalising groups of people who use that form of expression, that form of communication, that form of engagement. We've got to do that better. And I think one of the things that has really struck me in some of the work that we've been doing, particularly around the Gypsy Roma Traveller community, is, if there is a lack of literacy in generations of a family, if there is a mistrust of public services, sending them a letter saying, you are entitled to this, and you need to come to this appointment, is not going to get through to people who need help. And it was really striking, I thought, that the moment there was a conversation with somebody from the community and said, no, this is okay, you are entitled to this, you can have this, people will come and help you, that changed everything. So I think we just need to think a little differently about building that trust, working with people, rather than seeming like we're coming in as the experts and telling them what to do. But that's a very personal view, I wish you'd add.
Effectiveness of present strategy aim at preventing violence before it occurs, that is preventive measures. But the challenges are in delivering these preventive measures. Is there a way these strategies could be enhanced?
It's always
catch that, Naomi, did you?
Yes, a bit, Joe. You'll probably gather from my answer. I think one of the issues is always the difficulty of evidencing the impact of preventative work. But, it doesn't mean that we can't start there. So just picking up on what Joe was saying earlier about working with communities, and again, having somebody that people trust. It's not people in suits who turn up to do this. So one of the examples was around the arrival of Afghan refugees within some of the earth centres, for example. So one of the things that became clear quite early on was that the women and girls wanted an opportunity to talk amongst themselves. So yes, the arrival was very good and it was much supported, but that opportunity for women and girls to have their own little group, to talk about some of their experiences, to have people in to talk to them, again, gives that opportunity to raise those issues as a preventative measure, in terms of being able to highlight some of the risks that can appear, but also about the standards that we expect and the support services that would be available at that time. I also heard Bauzo talking about some of the pilot work that they're undertaking, funded by the Home Office, but a lot of that seems to be more of the reactive rather than the proactive. And again, it's around which organisations would take this sort of responsibility forward in being able to address some of those steps. So I certainly know in some of the asylum dispersal areas that we would have, some of those sessions are held with women through the third sector groups. They come together, they talk around, not just because of that, it can appear as different conversations. But I think the prevention early intervention does require us to develop those positive relationships with communities, rely on people that those communities trust to be able to have those conversations, as Joe was saying. But also then, if we know that people, because there are some risk factors that we can identify. So if we've identified those risk factors, what steps are we taking to ensure that we can actually provide appropriate support or guidance along the way. So I think that there is more to be done around some of that prevention, early intervention, but particularly starting through the schools as well, and using all avenues that we have to communicate these important messages.
Thank you. I think we need to move on because I know Senedd still has some questions you want to ask. Senedd Williams.
Thank you, Chair. I want to look to the future, if I may. We've discussed what perhaps hasn't worked in the past and some of the steps that have been taken more recently. And I wanted to ask specifically about your view, and I think, Naomi, you made reference to the new refreshed strategy, the Fawda SV strategy. So what are the gaps in that strategy? What are your views on it? Joe, I think you mentioned that you didn't think that the lens in looking at it through the lens of migrant women was perhaps missing. And also perhaps if you could mention an issue that you touched on in terms of that deficiency in terms of the acute response to traumatic experiences. So anything you feel is perhaps missing or hasn't been adequately covered in that new strategy.
Thank you. I'll go first. Thank you, Senedd. So I think I expressed our dismay, if that's not too strong a word, despite extensive feedback. I felt not just from Public Health Wales, but from others who had responded to the consultation, that not expecting there to be, the mention of migrant women on every line, but at least an acknowledgement that there is a specific lens that needs to be applied here. So we are trying, obviously, to stop all forms of violence against women, against anyone. This isn't about saying these group here are more deserving, or this group here needs to have more attention, but it's about equality and access to services. And here is a group of women who have had an experience which is different. They may have the same experience in terms of being in a domestic abusive situation. I understand that. They may have the same sorts of experiences, perhaps of being, risk of sexual violence in the community, etc. But they have come here, in many cases, having experienced different cultural acceptance of violence, perhaps in the country that they've left, even if it's, if they're not talking about refugees, people who have migrated here, they have come from a different experience of the acceptance of domestic abuse. And then we know that there are extensive experiences through trafficking, through living in refugee camps, through lots of other things that form part of that migration journey, which may be as quick as a couple of weeks or it may be years. So here is a group of women who have had experiences that are different, regardless of whether you want to look at this in a holistic way. So we must recognise that. And I think we're disappointed that wasn't clearer in the Fawda SV strategy, because, as I said, I am not clear where that sits. I am not clear where we are picking this up in terms of Welsh Government policy and process. The work that's going on at the moment to look at particularly the more acute impacts, I would say, or the kind of the outcomes of having experienced these forms of violence, some of which might be impacts on mental health. I think there is some really, really good work underway at the moment to look at how we ensure that we are inclusive in our approaches to kind of putting together packages or training around complex PTSD and PTSD. That's great. What's interesting, though, and what I'm hearing is that whilst that's a real need and a gap, there is a bigger need for people to just be able to understand what they do if someone presents in front of them who've had this experience. Where do they signpost them to for support? So it's more in the sort of more less in the acute space, because I think people get there over time if they don't have access to the sorts of services they might need to prevent that from happening. And what we were hearing from practitioners and those working with particularly refugees and asylum seekers was that those waiting lists are still very, very long. What do we do here and now to help people to cope with the experiences that they are trying to deal with? So how can we, as professionals or as members of the public or members of the community, access the kind of tools or training or anything that might support that? So that's why I think, and it's a forthcoming thing, that the work we're doing on the national trauma framework will be a helpful thing, because what we're trying to do is say there is a continuum here, from a universal response of everyone being more aware right up to that acute lens, but we really need to consider these experiences within that, so we don't get really quickly into that homogenous, well, everybody's had the same sort of experience and this is what, you know, because this group has had a different experience. So I think that's my kind of key point here, is that there's some really good pockets of good work, but I just think that overall we are still further marginalising this group by just making them more invisible, by not including them overtly in sorts of strategies and plans that are there to support everyone.
And just to pick up on that quickly, because I know we're short of time, just building on that, I think what would be helpful, because as Joe said, they're not, this group of people are not specifically mentioned, that there used to be a policy, a strategy in Welsh Government around FGM, but that's way out of date now. So is there an opportunity to be able to develop some, I know there's not strategies per se, but plans or, you know, specific actions that will address some of these issues? So you're addressing that gap, if you like, because I think it does need more investment in this area, I think we said earlier, but it's about sustainable investment. But what you might need is an injection of some of that work so that we can bring everything up to speed. So I think it does need a bit of a planned approach. You know, there are, as Joe said, there are pockets of good work, but how do we bring this together so that it is seen as a planned approach to addressing this in a holistic way that would look at guidance, it would have materials available, you'd have training, but as Joe said, it's also being able to know where to refer people to. So we do need some of those other specialist services delivered by probably our third sector partners across Wales in different ways to be able to have that confidence. And then ensuring that the support mechanism we have in place, so for example, refuges, are culturally appropriate. So if people arrive there, that they are welcome, because obviously refuges and other places just reflect society. So if people experience racism within that, that's going to actually re-traumatize and reinforce some of those negative perceptions. So again, making sure that our existing services, you know, are respectful, based on equality and respect for people. So as I said, I think it's as earlier, we need to mainstream what we're doing to make sure that standard services are right. But in the meantime, while bringing people up to speed, we might need to look at how we develop some of those specialist services while we ensure that those skills and that knowledge is there more generally across public services as well.
Diolch, ni yn bryn o amser, felly...
Thank you, we are short of time. I did want to ask you more specifically about those examples of best practice out with Wales, perhaps, in terms of supporting migrant women that the Welsh Government could perhaps learn from. We don't have time this afternoon to discuss that, so if I could ask you to write to the committee with any examples that you would like to highlight in that regard. And I just wanted to ask Joe very briefly, you have mentioned this issue. I was just wondering if you had anything to add in terms of this idea of a public health approach in tackling Fawda SV, in terms of addressing those underlying risk factors that increase the likelihood that an individual will become a survivor or a perpetrator. We haven't really talked much about that this afternoon. So I was wondering whether you had anything to add to what you've already mentioned.
I'd be very happy to send in some more written representations, Senedd, if that would be helpful. But I think from a really kind of quick perspective here, just to add that any public health approach starts with that premise of we need to understand what the data, what the evidence tells us. We've had 3 reports now in the last 10 years that tells us there are specific experiences of this group of women and girls in Wales, which is actually really groundbreaking. I shouldn't say this in a negative sense. We are way ahead of most other places in terms of having done these pieces of work, but we have some evidence here. So public health approach says you have evidence and then you need to move forward into taking some action in terms of thinking about what are those underlying causes, what are the root causes. I think, in the same way as we talk about the root cause of this being obviously oppression, and obviously thinking about power dynamics and coercive control and everything else, we do need to take that specific lens to this group, because I think when we do that, we will see real evidence of a challenge that we need to meet as we move forward in the implementation, because if we don't, then we won't meet the needs of this group. I'll give you a really specific example just very quickly. There's a report done in 2015 by the WHO which asked Afghan women about their experiences of violence in the home. And I think it was over, I'll send it to you, but over 80% of them thought it was acceptable for their husband to have hit them. And I think, if we're dealing with something where it's culturally embedded and ingrained, and people are coming to the UK where they have this sudden awakening, if you like, that actually this might not be the way things have to be, then that public health approach really needs to capture that and look at those areas that we need to focus on. But I can send further detail.
Can I just say, it's a final point, but I think that the point you made there, Senedd, around perpetrators as well. So a lot of the points that we would have made today around seeing it through different lenses, the issues there, addressing those cultural norms per se does need to be addressed, because any work that we're doing around perpetrators will have similar lessons for dealing with perpetrators from migrant communities as well. And that long-term need to get to a place of safety for women, we do need to tackle not only supporting victims, but making sure that perpetrators are aware of their behaviour. So I just would endorse that final point.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed, both of you. A really fascinating session with such a lot of expertise from both of you. So I'd like to thank you both. We will send you a transcript of your evidence, and please do check it carefully to make sure that we've captured your evidence accurately. And also thank you for any additional information that you may have time to submit. And so thank you very much indeed. The committee will now take a short break before the next session, which is due to start I think if we could try and start the next session at 4:05, that would just give us time to get the new witnesses in. And thank you very much indeed. Bryn Handa, welcome back to our third scrutiny session of our inquiry into violence against women, domestic abuse and sexual violence, and how it relates to migrant women. So I'm very pleased in this third session to welcome Kirsty Thompson from Just Right Scotland to help us understand what are the boundaries that we can push in order to meet the needs of this vulnerable group of women. So very much welcome to you, and thank you very much for giving up your time. And Jane Dodds is going to open the discussion.
Hello there, Kirsty. Thank you very much for joining us. Diolch yn fawr iawn. I wanted to specifically ask you two really interesting things, I hope, in terms of the Scottish experience from the March 2021 report, Ending Destitution Together, a strategy to improve support for people with no recourse to public funds. And it's a strategy over 3 years till 2024. We've heard a lot about the issues affecting migrant women and those who have no recourse to public funds. So I wanted to really just ask you, what the good things were from it, but two things that occurred to me in reading a little synopsis of it was around access to refuges. And something I'm sure my colleague Sarah Murphy will pick up later, which is I understand that you have an approach which is that sharing, it is never the right move to share data. And there may be other points that you want to highlight for us in a more general way, but I was specifically interested in those two issues. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for allowing me to attend to give the Scottish perspective. And yes, Jane, I will try and answer your questions. Firstly, in terms of ending destitution together, I mean, I think what's good about it is that it exists in and of itself. As far as I'm aware, it's one of the first strategies of its kind that sets out what it itself says is quite an ambitious plan and strategy. In and of itself, it didn't just come out of nothing. It came out of a number of different inquiries, pieces of research, from third sector, from academia, a Scottish Parliament inquiry similar to what you're doing. So it built on a lot of that work in order to pull this strategy together. And the fact of having it sets out a commitment. It doesn't say it has all the answers, but it quite clearly states, we're going to work together in order to try and work out what some of those are. And what is a very complex area, particularly in terms of that nexus between devolved and reserved. And what I think it does in terms of that framework, and there has been a lot of learning as well in terms of COVID, it builds confidence in terms of how far a government can go, what are those parameters, and it creates space to look at funding, to look at frameworks, and to push those parameters further than they've been pushed before. So that's what I would say about the strategy in and of itself. It is incredibly useful. And as I say, we are involved in many different strands of that work. So practically, I can see how useful it has been and also how it is moving us forward in Scotland. We've got somewhere to go, but we're on that journey with a route map. In terms of your question about access to refugees, can I just ask you to be more specific on that? Is that in terms of not having access in terms of public funds?
Yeah, so specifically you have this strategy which is about support to people who have no recourse to public funds. In the strategy, I couldn't see anything that referred to access to refuge places for women. You know, there's lots of other really interesting points, but could you just talk a little bit about that? Because obviously we've got the rest of it, but really interesting to hear about that issue.
So historically, access to, or from my understanding, historically access to a refuge space in Scotland has been funded via a public fund, basically. Hence why there's a barrier there when we look at no recourse to public funds. However, in part, as a result of this strategy, what civil society, including ourselves and others, have committed to do is to look at where we can bring in other funding for specialist support, including that provided in a refuge. And there's some clear examples of that in terms of where I think the government and others have increased in confidence, particularly in the last year or so, in providing funding to third sector partners through crisis funds or destitution funds, whatever we wish to call them, that allows that route, that allows that pathway. Again, we're still on that journey. We've taken steps to see how we can work within the context of that reserved position. And we're growing confidence, and some recent, and I think I've provided a briefing and a recent example of that, where local authority kind of grant funding has been given to Women's Aid and Red Cross in order to provide access in that area.
Thank you so much, Chair. I'll pass on. Thank you very much, Diolch.
Very good. Can I, Sarah Murphy, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for being here today. The question that I wanted to ask you about is about data sharing. It's something that we touched on in the previous sessions today, but having a look through the Just Right Scotland blog, I can see that there was that incident last year in Glasgow where there was the dawn raid and the community came out and stopped 2 migrant men from being deported. And at the time, you said that you're calling for an end to any cooperation on data sharing between Police Scotland and the UK Government's Home Office unless it is a legitimate matter of public safety. And just to kind of tie this all together, in our evidence that we've heard, there are women who sometimes the perpetrator actually threatens them by saying, if you go to the police about the domestic violence and abuse, then you'll get deported because they're going to tell immigration and visa and you're not meant to be here. So it's used as a part of that coercion and that abuse. But also then we've heard from the agencies, some of the agencies, the organisations like BAUSO and other third sector organisations that they obviously suggest to women who have come forward to them and given these heartbreaking stories for them to go to the police about it. And then whether it's true or not, anecdotally there are these stories then about the women being contacted by visa and immigration. So all of this is creating barriers. So I just wanted to ask, what has been the outcome from that? Have you had further discussions with the Scottish Government about this? Is there anything that can be done? Is there anything that you think that we could also do here in Wales to address this?
Yes, this has been a long-standing issue in terms of data protection, information sharing, and firewalls, and we have done quite a bit of work on this in trying to establish what the various positions are and where there are agreements or memorandums of understanding, and also trying to work to raise awareness, but also try to set out the legal position as we understand it, because there are conflicts in terms of the legislation that exists in Scotland as they do in Wales. It comes from a UK perspective in terms of what's in the immigration law, and our position is that there's a conflict in terms of GDPR and human rights legislation. It is an incredibly complex area. We have worked with a number of agencies around about this. And what you've repeated back our position on this. It's clearly a good position, but in terms of working towards adopting that, there are a number of steps along the way to that. What we have been trying to do is to seek clarity and transparency and consistency, and they are needed in this area, and we have still got some way to go on that in Scotland. We were involved in the establishment of guidance with local authorities and government around about migration and rights and entitlements. And as far as we're aware, it's the only document that starts to actually try and tackle this problem in terms of setting out, that it exists, and what's the legal background, but more than that, what's the framework? What's the framework that authorities and others can operate within? We also think there are inconsistencies in terms of practice in Scotland, and we think there needs to be a consistent nationwide approach to this, backed up in guidance. So it is complex. It requires to be tackled. I think it's something that we require to move towards in partnership with police, with public authorities, with government. Our role in that is trying to share our understanding in terms of the legal position, in terms of what is good practice, to try and bring the survivor experience to that, to try and highlight good practice in terms of, for instance, I think I highlighted the NHS's good practice in terms of its clarity in terms of a statement in this area, and try and work towards that clear framework from a national perspective. I think that's going to take time, but consistently it is an issue that comes up, not just from survivors, but from agencies that work in this field, including statutory, including third sector, when everyone is confused, when everyone finds it complex, and when it is inconsistent, then we can't have that.
Thank you so much, Kirsty. I really appreciate that. That's all I have, Chair. Thank you very much.
Very good, thank you. Altaf Hussain.
Oh, thank you very much, Chair. Thanks, Kirsty. It is regarding the access to specialist support. What steps has the Scottish Government taken to ensure migrant women and girls can access their specialist support for the accommodation, both physical and mental health, and legal support?
Yeah, I think the Scottish Government is a model of good practice in this area. I think I have been working in the front line for about 14 or 15 years now, and for most of that time, the projects I've been working in have received some kind of funding from the Scottish Government under its broader violence against women and girls strategies, but with a specific, we've been funded to specifically work in the area of migrant women. I think the Scottish Government has made clear political commitments in this area, backed up by quite substantial funding. And what that does is it not only just creates those support services, but over the years it's created again that partnership, that multi-agency working. If I'm funded to work in this area, then I can attend various working groups, research, inquiries, as we try and work through some of these difficult issues that you've already raised this afternoon. We have the funding, I think packages are very good in terms of the funding they provide to specialist support in terms of women's organisations. The Scottish Government also funds specific health interventions, and it funds us. So I am part of legal projects that are funded to provide specific legal advice to migrant women across Scotland, either through dedicated projects or also more broadly through, we have the Scottish Women's Rights Centre, for instance. So migrant women often access our projects in different ways, but there's often some government funding attached to this. With COVID-19, I think the Scottish Government worked with ourselves and others to make a clear statement and set out a clear framework in terms of what migrants, and particularly migrant women fleeing abuse, must have access in terms of a public health response to accommodation and support. And in the last week, that's been updated as we're moving out of the pandemic to be quite clear in terms of the requirements for support. And I also think, as I've said, I think the Scottish Government is becoming more confident in terms of funding, not only the kind of advice or support services, but they've also funded third sector partners to provide accommodation. Safe in Scotland's a good example of that. Recognising alongside local authorities that actually funded third sector partners are really useful allies in terms of working through some of these parameters and being able to deliver some of the kind of crisis support, but also accommodation. And recognising that you need those pathways to exit a situation of destitution or a situation of violence. The access to a crisis grant or a crisis fund or a refuge is great, but you need that specialist support in terms of advocacy, but also legal support to make sure that's a medium to longer term, there's a safer medium to longer term outcome in that. And legal advice has been key through all of this. It's very difficult to not provide assistance to someone with an uncertain migration status who's at risk of violence, and they're not being legal advice in there somehow in terms of working out the next step.
Oh, thank you very much. Now, what steps has the Scottish Government taken to ensure those who have no recourse to public funding can access support like the hardship fund? And what have been the key challenges and barriers for this, to access this fund?
Yeah, as I say, I think we've made quite quite significant progress in the last few years in the area of no recourse to public funds, in terms of trying to work through these barriers and trying to understand the parameters in which we have the power to act and also must act regardless of the NRPF condition. And I think I've highlighted some really good examples. The COVID-19 guidance and framework that was produced by the government in partnership with a variety of people was so clear in that. But it wasn't just a clear statement, it actually set out, and this is the framework, this is how to make sure this happens. Another good example was the isolation funding. So there was isolation funding available, for instance, throughout the UK during COVID, but that did come out of a fund that would be classed a public fund in terms of immigration legislation. But the Scottish Government created a pathway, and made it clear that if someone was trying to access that had no recourse to public funds, they created another pathway so that those individuals could get that fund in a way that wouldn't be classed as accessing public funds. They've also, as I say, they've funded accommodation. So Safe in Scotland provides accommodation and support to those who have no recourse to public funds. That's quite a shift. It's a real confidence in terms of the government working with others to be clear of where it can act and how best it can act. And I think we're on that journey there. And even moving forward, those referral pathways, so bringing those referral pathways in place. It also has a crisis fund, which came out of the inquiry that the Scottish Parliament did that I spoke to, and that's administered by British Red Cross, and that's delivered again in partnership with a range of people. And there's other initiatives like that are ongoing, all come out of funded initiatives, but are all trying to put in place this framework and this pathway. We recognise that there's further We need to do further work in terms of referral pathways, particularly in terms of housing, picking up on Jane's point at the start, but that's about to start. So I think they have shown leadership in terms of moving forward and trying to come up with access to support and pathways. More to be done, but I think they should be commended in terms of what they've done so far.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Pleasure, thank you. I just wanted to explore the role of public bodies and how well they comply with the law, regardless of whether or not somebody has no recourse to public funds. So in Wales, we have a Social Services and Wellbeing Act, which you know, particularly in relation to children, but also to vulnerable adults, there's an obligation to act. Yeah. What information can you share with us about the law in Scotland and how public bodies approach those obligations against the gap in funding?
Yeah. Again, we've very much been on a journey with what I suspect is very similar legislation in Scotland around about a power to provide support for children, vulnerable families, vulnerable adults, and where there's a duty to do so under human rights legislation, and then what pot of funding that comes out of in terms of the local authority. So I think the same, we're on the same journey, if that makes sense. The same issues have come up for many years now in this area. And they were clearly noted in terms of the 2017 inquiry from the Scottish Parliament in this area. In terms of compliance, you know, it is such a complex area, that you know, that to ensure consistency in this area is very difficult. We had certainly found quite a number of years ago that there was a lack of awareness and knowledge in this area in terms of what can be used, what powers can be used, when they should be used, and again where that funding comes from. A big bit of work that we did in this area with COSLA, our Organisation of Local Authorities, and the Scottish Government in 2019 was we created, and it was my colleague that did this, created a guide. So really tried to set out in as clear a way as possible what the rights and entitlements are for migrants in terms of accessing local authority support, and what local authorities and social work should consider in terms of providing that. That was followed up by a national training programme, and we're just about to revisit and update that now. That has been a really good first step, but there's more to be done in terms of creating local frameworks for public authorities, trying to tease it out more in terms of what happens when a woman approaches homelessness assistance. And we've been doing some work on that in Glasgow through the Glasgow Violence Against Women Partnership. And it really does, when you try and work out a woman's journey through that process, it is complex. And I still fear that the first question that is asked is, what's the person's immigration status? Rather than, you know, what are the risks and background and vulnerabilities here that may trigger our duties in this area, and then may link into that funding pot. Again, work going on in this in Scotland. We ourselves are about to commission a legal opinion in this area, just to kind of further check our understanding in terms of parameters, in terms of local authorities' obligations, but also because we're very aware there's a funding question to this, and that is really important in terms of implementation. And we really want this opinion to look at some of that in terms of coming into their answers. we did this last year in terms of the Nationality and Borders Bill, which is now an Act, because we really felt we needed to contribute some information and awareness around about how something that's reserved has a real impact on devolved areas, and we want to do something similar with no recourse to public funds because it keeps coming up. We think we need a little bit more of an input to help us with the work that's ongoing, and it keeps coming up because it is increasingly becoming more of an issue in terms of numbers. And numbers in areas of Scotland that would never have seen this before. So that's where we are. I suspect some of the same issues. There's also a question over, is it just a problem of implementation, or is it or is there some work that we need to do to tighten up national legislation in this area in terms of what is a vulnerable adult, for instance, in terms of guidance? And these are all questions that are being looked at and are being proactively explored through some of these working groups and pathways created from the strategies that I've spoken about. And happy to share all of that work as we go forward.
A particular aspect on this that I'm very interested in is, as all money is fungible at one level, and dealing with violence in a domestic context, gender-based violence is a really complicated subject, regardless of people's migrant status. I just wondered how you can approach funding for these expert bodies, that if you have private, voluntary or community funds involved, does it then eliminate the need to be making distinctions between individuals whose immigration status doesn't allow them access to public funds, as opposed to somebody who has?
I think we were, and I think it comes back to the point I made earlier, definitely third sector and funding in that way is incredibly useful, and we are useful allies in terms of a response. However, it can't be the only response, and funding, in terms of trying to work out these pathways and in these kind of working groups, funding is key, and funding is a key barrier as well in terms of people being able to or provide support at any level. And I do think, and I think it's been recognised at government local authority level, that we need to find, a route to be able for the government or local authorities to provide funding even to others in order to provide services. It can't just come from private, charitable or philanthropic kind of trusts. It needs to be there, and it's really complementary. But given the demand that we're seeing in this area and that it is going to increase, it's not enough just to rely on that. I'm not saying it's easy to work out the funding in a way that is compliant, but we have committed to doing that and to trying to work through some of this. And as I say, I think the government and local authorities are growing in confidence in that. We're on a journey and still on that journey.
So it's still to be fully tested. Okay, well, thank you. I'll pass on to Senedd Williams, who wants to explore areas of good practice.
Diolch, Cadeirydd, a diolch, Kirsty.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Kirsty. You've mentioned a number of examples of good practice already, but I just wanted to ask you to tell us about the aspects of policy and support in your nation that the Welsh Government could learn from. Now, we heard in an earlier evidence session about how the Scottish Government is working strategically in partnership with the Scottish Refugee Council, for example. So I'd like to hear your views on that. You have mentioned how the government deals with no recourse to public funds, which isn't something that happens in Wales. So any aspects on best practice that you think that we could learn from?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. Yeah, I think in terms of good practice and in terms of kind of government and local funding, I think there is something in here about multi-agency and that working across sectors, bringing different expertise, be that legal, be that Refugee Council, Red Cross, Women's Aid, and bringing all of that round the same table, and also in terms of that response. And I can give you two examples. One is that I chair a working group in my guise as the third sector, but it's for a local authority violence against women partnership. It's called the yw'r group. It has a focus on migrant women. That was resurrected last year after a hiatus of a couple of years. And in the last year, and it brings together like authorities and third sector within a local area. We have committed to increasing data and to improving our monitoring and evaluation in terms of issues affecting migrant women and including NRPF, because there's no data, no consistent data in terms of which to monitor where we are and where we're going. We have just come out with a statement on why a gendered response is needed in response to the crisis in Ukraine. It has provided funding to Women's Aid and British Red Cross in order to provide a crisis fund to women fleeing violence who may not have access to other services, and has wrapped around that access to legal advice. That is just an example of strategic partnership at a local level coming together, and in a very short period of time inputting in a range of places. Another good example, and I will touch on Scottish Refugee Council, is some funding that's been obtained. This is not through Scottish Government. It's called Fairways Scotland, and that is a partnership of charities, including ourselves at Just Right Scotland and Scottish Refugee Council, working with academics and funders to develop a human rights-based approach to ending destitution. That will provide accommodation and access to legal advice, advice on finance, a whole host of kind of services, and where that will also work with local authorities in Scotland to kind of improve their response. So it's always, for me, it's been the partnership, and that partnership across government, local authority, police don't always agree, nor would I expect us to agree. But we come together and we try and understand what the barriers are, where the problems are, and we try and proactively come up with solutions. And for me, these are some, I think I've mentioned quite a few examples. They would not come if there wasn't such a clear political commitment and well-funded organisations that can come together in this space. I'm a lawyer. We provide, I think we have 3 sets of funding that ensures that we can support nearly all of these initiatives that involve migrant women. That commitment, that funding, and that partnership.
Diolch yn fawr. Diolch, Cadeirydd.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Very good. It's, I suppose, one of the points that arises out of all this is what is likely to be the response of the UK government, who have passed the Nationality and Borders Act, regardless of the fact that certain sections of it, at least, were not given legislative consent by either the Welsh Parliament or the Scottish Parliament. So, you know, how much of important, you know, and busy organisations in Scotland's time is going to be tied up in legal arguments about what is devolved and what is not devolved?
Yeah. Really good question. And for us, when this first arose, we decided to get a legal opinion and do some work in this area for a number of reasons. And one was, and again, this came out of the Glasgow yw'r group that I mentioned that I chair. One was that there just wasn't an understanding across Scotland in terms of service providers, social work, police, health, in terms of the impact of this legislation. So a big bit of what we did was raise awareness, and I've heard, and we did that in private sessions with public authorities and ourselves. And I've heard time and time again how useful that was. There just was not that awareness of what was coming. The second part of why we did this was to create understanding. Consistently, we were asked as lawyers, oh, well, surely the UK government apparently cannot do this, and you can come in and go to court over this, etc., which of course we can't. And so a little bit of this was raising awareness of how far we can go in terms of devolution, and again, we've heard back how helpful that was in terms of policy and communication strands that were going on around about that time in terms of what could be done in Scotland. But behind the scenes, Jenny, really what was happening, that was going on in terms of the work looking at the consent motions, etc. But really what we were doing was trying to build awareness and trying to get authorities and partners to look at now what we have now in terms of our strategies, in terms of our projects and frameworks. Can we go back and review those to make sure they're as strong as they can be? Do they need to be tweaked? Do they need to be amended in order to mitigate the impact of what's coming? And really a lot of work went into that. And having the opinion and raising awareness and bringing people together was a really good opportunity to do the policy and communications work around about withholding consent, etc. It was really an opportunity, to be honest, to bring lots of people around and to start thinking and proactively thinking through what services are needed, what can we do, because the impact of this legislation will be to increase those with no access to public funds requiring support in areas of Scotland that maybe haven't come across that before. And we're still doing that work and we'll still continue to do that work. And I think if we hadn't, we would have been reacting at a Scottish multi-agency level rather than being proactive. And it was also a really good opportunity to understand the parameters that local authorities have and operate within. And, you know, they were very clear about, you know, it's our staff that are going to have to deal with these presentations. And it was trying to build an understanding of their parameters as well and try and come together to, you know, at this collectively, not blaming, nothing like that. Just, okay, what tools do we have that we can think through this and use to mitigate these impacts?
Thank you. That was really interesting to hear. Does any other members want to ask any further questions? Well, thank you very much indeed for your time. We'll send you a transcript of your evidence, and obviously you should correct it if we've misinterpreted what you've said. And otherwise, we thank you very much indeed for the insight into how Scotland is handling this really complex subject.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. So before we move into private sessions, I wondered if we can agree the three papers that the 3 sets of papers that are on the agenda to be noted, unless anybody wishes to raise any matters arising from those papers before we do so. I can't see anybody objecting, so if we can note those 3 papers, and can I get your agreement to exclude the public from the remainder of today's meetings, and also the short meeting we are going to be holding on the 9th of June, this coming Thursday. Thank you very much. If we could now move into private session.